The street was silent, the only sound coming from the rustling leaves and the cold night air. Then boom! A wall of flames erupted, lighting up the darkness. A house stood burning, smoke curling into the sky like a terrible omen. The Blackwell family's home reduced to ashes. And across the street, a smirking white woman, arms crossed, watching the destruction like she had just won. Her name was Margaret Stevens, and she thought she had finally gotten rid of them. But what Margaret did not know was that the family she tried to destroy was the last family she should have messed with. And by the time she realized it, it was far too late. Before we go any further, subscribe to the channel and comment below where you are watching from. For our returning subscribers, thank you so much for your unwavering support. It truly means a lot to our community. For the Blackwell family, this house was not just bricks and wood. It was a symbol of everything they had worked for. A home built with love, dreams, and sacrifice. But for Margaret Stevens, it was an eyesore. Because to her, the Blackwells did not belong. They were too different, too new, too black. And from the moment they moved in, Margaret had one goal: to make their lives miserable. And when intimidation wasn't enough, she took things to the next level. And what she did would shock everyone. Margaret had always believed in protecting her neighborhood. She controlled everything. At least, that's what she told herself. She reported people for minor infractions. Trash cans out a minute too long. HOA violation. She judged anyone who wasn't like her. And the Blackwells? They were her biggest problem yet. The harassment begins. The moment the Blackwells moved in, Margaret started her campaign of intimidation. It started small. I just want to make sure you understand the HOA rules. Then, it became more aggressive. Your decorations are too flashy. We have standards here. Then, it became personal. I don't know if you people can afford this neighborhood, but we don't allow rental properties. And every time, the Blackwells ignored her, because they knew exactly what she was doing. And that drove Margaret insane. Margaret was fed up. The Blackwells had refused to leave, refused to bend. So she decided to force their hand. One cold evening, when she saw the Blackwells' car drive away, she put her plan into motion. She broke their windows. She spray-painted their walls with slurs. She slashed their tires. But she still wasn't satisfied, because they could fix all that. No, she needed to make sure they would never come back. So she did something unthinkable. That night, as the neighborhood slept peacefully, a small flicker of orange light glowed in the darkness. And within minutes, flames engulfed the Blackwell home. Neighbors awoke to the sound of sirens, the crackling of wood, and the smell of smoke. The Blackwell house? Destroyed. Their home? Gone. And Margaret? She stood outside, watching the destruction, feeling victorious. But what Margaret didn't know was that the fire would expose everything, and the people she tried to ruin were about to ruin her instead. Margaret stood outside, watching the flames consume the Blackwells' home. The heat from the fire warmed her face, but it was the satisfaction that truly burned inside her. That should take care of them, she muttered to herself, crossing her arms. She expected sirens, chaos, destruction. She wanted them to come back to nothing, to finally leave. But what she did not expect was for this single act to unravel her entire life, because Margaret had no idea who the Blackwells really were. Within minutes, the screaming sirens filled the neighborhood. Fire trucks roared onto the street. Police cars pulled up, lights flashing. Neighbors stood outside, watching in shock. Margaret put on her best performance. "Oh my goodness," she gasped. "This is terrible. How could this have happened?" She clutched her chest dramatically, shaking her head in fake concern. A few neighbors looked at her strangely, but no one said anything. Yet, then, just as she thought she had fooled everyone, a black SUV pulled up, and out stepped the Blackwells. Margaret's heart dropped. "Wait, they weren't inside?" she whispered under her breath. She had been so sure they were home, so sure she had gotten rid of them. But now, they were standing right there, And worst of all, they looked angrier than she had ever seen them. As soon as Mr. Blackwell saw his home in flames, his jaw tightened. He turned to his wife, who was holding their shaking son close to her chest. "Take Noah to the car," he said calmly. Mrs. Blackwell didn't argue, because she knew exactly what was about to happen. Mr. Blackwell turned and locked eyes with Margaret. And then, he smirked. Margaret froze, because something about that look terrified her. Then, a police officer walked up to Mr. Blackwell, looking concerned. "Sir, I assume this is your home?" "Yes," Mr. Blackwell said, nodding. "And I'd like to file charges against the person responsible for this fire." Margaret's stomach twisted. "Wait, charges?" The officer nodded. "Yes, ma'am. This isn't just a fire. This is an active arson investigation." Margaret's knees wobbled. "Arson?" she gasped, playing dumb. "Surely this was just an accident." Mr. Blackwell let out a short chuckle. "An accident? You think we don't know what you've been doing, Margaret?" Margaret's breath hitched. The way he said her name, like he had been waiting for this moment. Then, just when she thought things couldn't get worse, one of the officers stepped forward. "Sir, we're going to need to ask you a few questions for our report. But first, can we get your official title?" Mr. Blackwell smiled. "Sure. My name is Jonathan Blackwell, and I'm the district attorney." The entire street went silent. Margaret felt like the ground had been ripped out from beneath her, because the man whose home she just destroyed was the most powerful prosecutor in the county. And now, she had his full attention. Margaret staggered back, her brain trying to process what she just heard. "District attorney?" she stammered. Mr. Blackwell's smile never faded. "That's right," he said smoothly. "And do you know what that means?" Margaret shook her head, trembling. "It means I prosecute criminals. I put arsonists, racists, and people who break the law behind bars. You know, people like you." Margaret's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out, because this wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to scare them away. Not this. Not get caught. Not go to jail. Then, one of the officers stepped forward. "Ma'am, do you have an alibi for tonight?" Margaret's stomach dropped. "Alibi?" she repeated. "Two was at home. Two didn't do anything." But as she spoke, another officer walked up, holding something in his hand. A security camera flash drive. "Sir," the officer said, handing it to Mr. Blackwell. "We pulled footage from the neighbor's security cameras. It clearly shows Miss Stevens near the Blackwell home moments before the fire started." Margaret felt like she was going to faint, because suddenly, the story had changed. She wasn't a concerned neighbor. She wasn't a victim of change. She was a criminal. And now, everyone knew it. What happens next? Margaret thought she had won. She thought she had ruined the Blackwells' lives. But what she never expected was that she had just ruined her own, because within minutes, the police were putting her in handcuffs. The neighbors were recording everything. And by morning, her face would be all over the news. And the Blackwells, they weren't going anywhere. Because while Margaret sat in a jail cell, the Blackwells were already rebuilding. Margaret stood frozen, the cold steel of the handcuffs biting into her wrists. Her heart pounded wildly as the weight of the moment crashed down on her. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't something she could talk her way out of. This was real. She was being arrested for arson. And the worst part? The entire neighborhood was watching. Phones were recording. Neighbors whispered. The flashing red and blue lights painted her house in disgrace. She had spent years controlling this neighborhood. Now, she was leaving it in handcuffs. And the Blackwells were standing there watching it happen. "This is a mistake," she shrieked, struggling against the cuffs. "You can't arrest Mime, the victim." Officer Daniels let out a slow breath, clearly unamused. "Ma'am, you're on camera committing a felony. You're under arrest for arson and destruction of property." Margaret shook her head violently. No, this is their fault. If they hadn't moved here." "If they hadn't moved here? What?" The voice was sharp, controlled, and full of authority. Margaret snapped her head upright into the furious eyes of Jonathan Blackwell, the district attorney, the man she just tried to destroy, and the man who now held her fate in his hands. Jonathan took a step forward, standing over Margaret as she sat helplessly on the curb. "I want to hear it, Margaret," he said, his voice deadly calm. "If we hadn't moved here, what?" Margaret's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Because now, she had nothing to say. Because no excuse would save her. Jonathan let the silence drag out before finally shaking his head. "I've spent my career putting criminals behind bars, Margaret. I never thought I'd have to do it in my own neighborhood." Margaret flinched, knowing exactly what he meant. This wasn't just some petty dispute. This wasn't an argument between neighbors. This was a crime. And now, she was going to pay for it. As Margaret was hauled into the police car, she twisted her neck to glare at the crowd. "You'll all regret this," she screamed. But no one looked sympathetic. Because now, the truth was out. She wasn't the concerned neighbor. She wasn't the victim. She was the villain. And worse, the entire thing was live-streamed. News outlets picked up the story. Social media exploded. Within hours, the headlines read, "Racist woman arrested for arson after trying to destroy black family's home." Margaret had wanted the Blackwells gone. Instead, she was the one being erased. 2 weeks later, Jonathan and his wife stood in front of their burned home. It was gone, reduced to ashes and rubble. But they weren't defeated, because now, their story was national news. And the support was overwhelming. A GoFundMe was created and raised over $500,000 in 48 hours. Local businesses stepped in, offering to help rebuild. Volunteers from across the city showed up to support them. And the Blackwells started over. Because no matter how hard Margaret tried, she couldn't break them. She only made them stronger. In jail, Margaret watched the news in horror. The Blackwell family has begun rebuilding their home with overwhelming community support. She gritted her teeth. District Attorney Jonathan Blackwell has vowed to prosecute the arsonist to the fullest extent of the law. Her stomach turned. And as for Margaret Stevens, sources confirm she has lost her home, her reputation, and her freedom. Margaret screamed, throwing the television remote against the wall. Because in the end, she hadn't won. She had lost everything. And the Blackwells had everything they needed. Hate destroys everything. It touches, but love and resilience always win. If you believe in standing up for what's right, subscribe for more powerful stories.